When we did the episode on the 13th floor, I was planning to pair it with another film so that we had kind of dual film analysis episodes. And at the time of kind of planning that out, my first choice was Nirvana from 1997, but I'm just about the only person to have seen that movie, so I thought for the podcast it would be better to go with something a little better known. And I think the 13th floor can actually be really paired well with Paprika, which is an animated movie from Satoshi Kon released in 2006. That makes it, well, the 13th floor was 1999, so Paprika's a little bit later, but they're pretty much contemporary. And in a way, I like the choice of Paprika better than Nirvana because, well, you could almost say the difference between the 13th floor and Nirvana comes down to small details. While with Paprika, it's different, but with some common themes with those films. And so I figured we could do this episode on Paprika and, again, just use some of my writings on that film in the book The Two Truths as a basic structure. And, again, I grabbed a summary of the film from IMDb. So thanks to Jay Haley for this description. 3 scientists at the Foundation for Psychiatric Research failed to secure a device they've invented, the DC Mini, which allows people to record and watch their dreams. A thief uses the device to enter people's minds when awake and distract them with their own dreams and those of others. Chaos ensues. The trio, Chiba, Tokita, and Shima, assisted by a police inspector and by a sprite named Paprika, must try to identify the thief as they ward off the thief's attacks on their own psyches. Dreams, reality, and the movies merge, while characters question the limits of science and the wisdom of Big Brother. That's not bad, but I guess just kind of mentioning a police inspector isn't really enough. Chiba Atsuko, one of the scientists at the Foundation for Psychiatric Research, she has been acting as Detective Konakawa's therapist and using the DC Mini to personally investigate his dreams. Konakawa is a mystery to himself in some ways, and we unravel that mystery while also unraveling the somewhat bigger mystery of the theft of the DC Mini. And we do that while unraveling some of the mysteries of reality. So for me, Detective Konakawa is a crucial part of the movie and what I want to say about it. So I just wanted to add that into his description.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because watching Paprika today, I felt like he was so central and it felt like a lot of it was actually about him.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I just want to add here, when I watched Perfect Blue, which was Cone's first movie, I felt for sure that the umbrella chase in it was influenced by Angel Dust, which is a Japanese movie from 1994, 3 years before Perfect Blue. And it's not a great movie, but the cinematography is absolutely beautiful, and the opening has this really great fake out. And also the soundtrack by Nagashima Hiroyuki is really awesome and ahead of its time. Kon used parts of Perfect Blue as meta-commentary on typical anime and on typical Japanese psychological thriller films. And while he was very critical of both, I really think that he was at least a little bit influenced by Angel Dust. So I just thought of that and to bring it up. And also, you know, the idea of his films being meta-commentaries on films, I think that will really work when we look at Paprika.
The film is called Angel Dust?
Yeah.
I'll have to add that to my list, to my queue.
There was a little bit of a synchronicity, which is kind of funny, but I watched 2 Japanese movies or shows this week from the 1990s that were influenced by John C. Lilly.
Oh, that's interesting. Just for the sake of listeners, could you give a basic introduction to John C. Lilly so people know what we're talking about?
That's a kind of tall order, isn't it?
Yeah, well, did he do research with sensory deprivation chambers, tanks, and so forth?
Right. He was pretty much the pioneer of that sensory deprivation devices. His isolation tanks, they became really popular, and he did a lot of work with trying to communicate with dolphins and so on. I like his idea of, I'm just going to grab this from Wikipedia, his idea of echo. That showed up in one of the shows that I watched this week. Here, I'll read from Wikipedia. In 1974, Lilly's research using various psychoactive drugs led him to believe in the existence of a certain hierarchical group of cosmic entities, the lowest of which he later dubbed Earth Coincidence Control Office, ECCO or ECHO.
So is he then attributing experiences of synchronicity to the operation of these beings?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's almost like Twin Peaks, right? With this hierarchical group of cosmic entities, and they're kind of affecting the lives of mankind.
Wait, I remember this guy too. You mentioned him when we were discussing The Shining. He's the one who trained with Oscar Ikazo?
Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, you were telling me that a lot of ideas that you find in Gurdjieff and Uspensky are also in Oscar Ikazo's work, and that because of the whole controversy, people saying that Oscar Ikazo was simply a plagiarist, he revealed more of the common sources that they actually had.
Yeah.
Talking about like Posidonius and so forth from the Stoic tradition.
Right.
Yeah.
So when Jung, talked about that things in the universe are structured not just on cause and effect, but also on meaning. And so you get this idea of like a greater meaning or a bigger picture to things. And that synchronicity is kind of linked up with that. And then Lilly saw that there were these beings kind of in charge of having that happen. So you could say beings that constantly grasp that bigger picture, something like that.
Wow. I just thought of an evangelical Christian I sometimes talk with, and I'm sure he would... he'd be very suspicious of all this. He'd say, yeah, they're demons. Okay, so you mentioned his influence on something? John C. Lilly's influence?
Yeah. He was an influence on Angel Dust and also on a Japanese show I watched this week. So that was a synchronicity that a show and a movie in a week referenced him. And then Lilly was like all about synchronicity with the Earth Coincidence Control Office. So I thought that was interesting. So just to kind of pair it with the previous podcast, I'd like to kind of remind the audience. In the 13th floor, people called users enter a simulated reality populated by humans called avatars. And the users are able to dive inside one of the avatars, one of the people in the simulation, and use them to live inside the simulation for some hours at a time. But for Paprika, instead of being an avatar in a fake world, or even a user who enters into an avatar and then takes that fake world as reality, people are put into their own and other people's dreams and kind of instantly take that as reality. So in Paprika, it's dreams which become the simulated reality. And then the dreams start merging into consensual waking reality. And it seems like at the end of the film that the world is going to disintegrate. So the 13th floor does it with this, computer simulation technology like we talked about. And then Paprika does it with Dream, but actually Paprika uses the DC Mini, which is a kind of dream technology. So you get a mix-up in Paprika of world simulations, virtual reality, realities implanted in brains, and all of that. And Paprika has a really strong meta aspect where you don't know if you are in reality or a dream. And it uses an effect like Lynch used in Inland Empire, where you're watching something seemingly real transpire, and then the camera pans back to reveal a camera, like it was just a movie set you were seeing. Or the film director yells cut, and you realize it was only a movie, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I just thought of a scene in Mulholland Drive where he announces before the singer comes out, I think, that the whole thing is lip-synced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then when you watch it, it becomes so emotional, and you really identify with the two characters watching her. And then she collapses, and the music continues, and then he comes out to remind you.
Yeah. That's a good connection. And that also gets into the seeming real fake divide, which I definitely want to get to later in this episode. So I guess the first main theme, a kind of warm-up really, that I want to talk about with Paprika is doppelgangers.
Okay, so how are we defining doppelgangers?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I kind of like to look at it first in terms of the 13th floor and then in terms of Paprika and see if there's some kind of common ground there. Actually, this is an interpretation for the 13th floor that I hadn't thought of while watching it. It was only when I watched Paprika that it came to me. That happens often to me. I get these kind of cross-film analyses. Some of my personally favorite interpretations came through doing that. It makes me kind of want to coin a word for it, like a portmanteau of interpenetration and interpretation. But anyway, in the 13th floor, the users and avatars are actually kind of the same person, right? Douglas Hall from the 1995 world goes into the 1937 simulation and his avatar looks exactly like him. You know, it's the same actor. So obviously what happened is the programmers of the simulation used themselves as the models for making some of the characters. So they are kind of the same person in a way. And in that sense, you could say that the users are the avatar's doppelgangers or vice versa. But I actually think it makes more sense to me to say that a user voyaging among the levels of the simulation changes into their own doppelganger. Like I think I mentioned at the end of the podcast on the 13th floor that Hannon Fuller was an old man, a serious scientist running a bleeding edge company. But when he would jump into his avatar, you know, he was a ballroom dandy who was having sex with prostitutes. So I think that kind of interpretation of it really fits with Paprika, where you see what looks like two different people, but it's really just two sides of the same character. Both sides are shown as being a reality to his character.
Okay, and there's also what you're describing with Fuller, that dandy, is the way that he fares forth in that 1937 simulation. There's also the actual person he inhabits, who's another individual.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he is shown to be in what looks like an unhappy marriage, right?
Right.
So I think that's also like another, you know, facet of Hannon showing up in the avatar.
Yeah, that's part of something I touched on when we spoke about this, that maybe he felt like he missed out on something, which is why he is going back to that time period to try to live it more fully.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess that's a good place to jump into the doppelgangers in Paprika. Pretty much all of Satoshi Kon's films deal with doppelgangers. The character Paprika herself, of course, is the dream doppelganger of Atsuko. Atsuko is a cold and reserved scientist with a very traditional Japanese look. But as Paprika, she's really vibrant and sexual, almost like a super heroine. And I would say that's something that Kon really started with in Perfect Blue, where Mima was kind of homely and messy, unconfident little girl. But when she put on her costume to sing in the idol group, she transformed into this beautiful symbolic goddess of purity. And that sort of female transformation through costume into a dream image is then repeated in Paprika, of course.
Right. I think it's also sustained a sizable swath of my dream life. An appreciable fraction of my daydreams. And
I absolutely love the opening credits to Paprika, with her appearing on a t-shirt and then kind of popping out of the t-shirt into something else and something else. It gets my adrenaline going. I'm just super excited to see the film from the opening credits.
Right. The music helps with that as well.
Yeah, which is, we talked about Hirasawa Susumu, the Japanese musician who uses Amigas in his setup, and, he did the soundtrack to Paprika. Absolutely fantastic music. I'm actually more a fan of his music when it's put to film.
That's an interesting quality that good film has. Sometimes it's true that a soundtrack can help to bring something out in a film, but also sometimes the images of the film, the context of a scene and everything, help to bring out a depth in music that you wouldn't normally be as attuned to.
Absolutely. I would just say that that's probably true with all of the collaborations between Kon and Hirasawa. So One level to the doppelgangers is your doppelganger basically comes from the unconscious. And certainly Kon uses that. One of the neat changes that he made from the original Paprika novel is that he has Paprika and Atsuko meet face to face. In the film, dream and reality start merging, so you get the real woman and the fake dream version of her meeting on the same plane of existence. Paprika and Atsuko have that doppelganger relation of really being the same person, but different aspects of the same person. And Paprika keeps dropping hints to Atsuko about how certain aspects of her personality are ruining her chances of happiness. And that really, to me, is showing that Paprika is Atsuko's subconscious, alerting her through dream, and as it were, through a dream girl version of herself. So in that sense, and in a number of senses, the whole film is about dreams and dream machines and so on. So the subconscious is a major theme in the film. I'm definitely going to come back to that in a bunch of different ways. But like with, Mima and virtual Mima in Perfect Blue, you get the sense that the subconscious somehow knows more about the person than the actual, if I could actually use that word, the actual person does. And there's this quote from Cormac McCarthy that I put in the book. I'll share that here. Cormac McCarthy wrote, "Of the known characteristics of the unconscious, its persistence is among the most notable. Everyone is familiar with repetitive dreams. Here the unconscious may well be imagined to have more than one voice. He's not getting it, is he? No, he's pretty thick. What do you want to do? I don't know. Do you want to try using his mother? His mother is dead. What difference does that make? What does it work here? And how does the unconscious know we're not getting it? What doesn't it know? It's hard to escape the conclusion that the unconscious is laboring under a moral compulsion to educate us."
There's a certain moment in the movie where there's an exchange between Chiba and Paprika. I don't remember the exact words, but it's something like, you say that I'm just a part of you. Maybe you're just a part of me.
Mm-hmm.
Which would make sense looking at it from the perspective of her being something in the shadow, possibly.
Yeah.
As a way to put it. What Jung talked about, most of the shadow is pure gold. If your conscious life is like the tip of an iceberg, then what is it that makes it primary? Because you could say, well, I'm the one making these decisions, but if there are all these unconscious factors that are affecting your process of making decisions and so forth, then how do you really relate those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a really good point. And there are certainly people that it seems that the subconscious is the one making all of the decisions.
Yeah. I'm not sure what the percentage is, but it's higher than...
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely that Kon would appreciate that interpretation. I want to get into that after kind of finishing up the doppelganger thing.
Right.
But, he was really into something very, very similar to the Lynch quote that we talked about combining opposites.
Right. It reminds me of Zizek commenting on people who take on various roles in video games and how they build their avatars and so forth.
Yeah.
Well, no, he's not like that in real life. He has this personality. He made that exact point. He said, who's to say that that's actually not him?
Mm-hmm.
If you turn into a vicious, abusive jackass online, who's to say that's not the real you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the overall interpretation I want to make of the face-to-face meeting between Atsuko and Paprika is that it complicates the ontology and brings to the fore this question of one or two. Is it one or two people, a doppelganger and a self, or the self projecting the doppelganger, a singularity or a duality? And that leads all the way up to the major question of whether the universe is one or two, whether it's a unified oneness or a marketplace manyness or somehow both. And with your interpretation, and what you just said about Zizek, it's like, yeah, which one is real, Atsuko or Paprika? And you really can't answer that question. It has to be both in some way. you problematize the idea that the ego is the real thing there when, as like I mentioned, in a lot of cases, it's the unconscious instead that's making all of the decisions. Of course, with virtual Mima, the same thing happened to Mima in Perfect Blue, where she kind of met this other aspect of her, and there was the battle between them over who was the real one. But anyway, what I want to start getting at there with inner over outer or outer over inner, or their relation, is the idea of opposites that in a bigger picture aren't actually opposites. That's kind of the next thing that I want to talk about. But just before that, you could equate a costume to a mask, and a mask is the persona, right?
Correct.
So the different appearances of a single person can represent clusters of personality traits. And, that gets at something also interesting in Japanese culture, which is the idea that change happens from the outside in. So when Atsuko transforms into Paprika, there's a change in appearance, and that outer change occasions Atsuko's inner change. And when the two of them finally meet face to face, all the things that Paprika tells Atsuko about herself cause her to change and finally show her, repressed feelings for Tokida and all of that. And, of course you could say that Paprika is Atsuko's subconscious, so the change happened on the inside first, but it actually wasn't until the subconscious manifested outside of her that change was made possible.
Well, if you have workings within yourself that you're not aware of, there's a certain way in which they are exterior to your awareness.
Right.
So that taking on some kind of form that you can see and then relate to, that would be the path into your awareness. So there is something about your unknown interior being alien to you.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the central features of the human condition.
Absolutely. I also like with this idea that change can happen from the outside in, that because so much within us is unknown to ourselves, that you can get around that whole thing by acting in a certain way. Pretending to be the Buddha is one of the prescribed ways to become a Buddha.
Yeah, you're also reminding me of two other things that Zizek said. He was talking about people being polite in Japan versus being somewhere in the West where the taxi driver is swearing the whole time and being really rude.
Yeah.
And there's this idea that somehow that's more authentic or... I mean, he was saying he prefers the Japanese approach.
Yeah.
And also that, this is just a thought that I have, part of what you're talking about there with that vulgar, aggressive manner of comportment could just be called a bad habit.
Yeah, certainly. And
then the other thought I had, Zizek was talking about how people have a sense of what their interior is, and that in some sense could counterbalance people's perceptions so that a person might behave in a certain way, but then they say, yeah, but if you knew my whole story, if you could see what the big picture is, you'd understand me better. But then he asks, how much of this big picture, true story narrative is just some story that you tell yourself to justify your behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate Zizek made a related point to what you just brought up about Japan. I think that essay was called Japan Through a Slovenian Looking Glass. But in another place, he talked about the kind of rules that societies have for politeness. For example, in the U.S., you'll get someone like, a cashier, saying, how are you doing today? You're supposed to take it not as being sincere, but also not as being a lie.
So this is another one of those balancing, is it real, is it fake?
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
And then, of course, you get people that actually just, the ego allows us to basically interface in society, and so it obeys those rules and it knows to say, fine, thanks, how are you, and all of that. But then you get like many, many, many people believe that that ego is the real thing, that that's their identity, when really all it is an interface to the society.
Well, some people who recognize this issue with the degree to which a person identifies with his or her persona, and then they challenge it, like they're taking issue with the hypocrisy of society.
Right.
Like someone says, "How are you today?" And the person responds, "You know you don't care. Why are you asking me that?" They have an attitude of being critical towards the society, but when people say that, it also feels vulgar and not quite as profound as it's supposed to be either.
Yeah. In my youth, I made like a kind of, similar mistake. I saw everyone as basically just faking it with each other, but there's a kind of realness to that fakeness, and that it's not that simple.
Yeah, well, one thing that's related to that is it's always felt awkward for me when I find out that somebody close to someone I know has died.
Oh, God, yeah. I know.
Because you feel that you're supposed to say, "I'm so sorry." But then because it feels like it's this automated response, you don't want to say it, but you want to say something, but you just don't know what to do.
Right.
And then sometimes what you might end up doing is actually say, "I'm sorry for your loss." And then some other philosophical or pseudo-philosophical person might overhear you speaking and think that it's all just some kind of scripted, soulless hypocrisy.
Yeah. And then you get people who there's actually no distance between them and the platitudes that are coming out of their mouth.
You're reminding me of Judge Sternwood in Twin Peaks.
So we're really kind of skating close to this idea of a kind of multi-layered, nested real and fakeness, or nested sets of identity within a single person. And I think I did a really good job of covering that in The Two Truths. So I'm just going to recommend people to, to check out that book if they're interested in, taking this line of thought further. But to bring it back to this idea of opposites that at a level aren't opposites. Really, to me, the ultimate symbol of that is the Yin Yang symbol. Of course, it's divided into black and white sides, but first it isn't that simple because each side has a little of its opposite within, which is their interpenetration. And then on top of that, the whole thing forms a perfect singular circle. So for me, within that symbol is the idea that the universe is both dual and non-dual. And at a smaller level, we are as well. And there has to be a way for us to understand that the opposites aren't opposites through a kind of change in perspective or a change in consciousness, which allows us to see that oneness. And for the yin yang, the first thing that I want to do is to quote Kon, the quote that we actually were talking about a little bit earlier. And this is my translation from the blog he used to write when he was still alive. He unfortunately died in 2010, and he was working on a new movie at the time called Dreaming Machine, or Machines That Dream, which certainly recalls Philip K. Dick, but Dreaming Machine or Machines That Dream got canceled because of his death, and I don't think it's ever going to get made. So while he was alive, he was writing a blog called Kon's Tone, and here's my translation of the quote. The conscious mind and the unconscious, subjectivity and objectivity, reality and dreams, yin and yang, the whole and the parts, the sun and the moon, man and woman. Balance and harmony between such opposites are important. If the emphasis on one or the other becomes extreme, I believe that both can be destroyed. Every movie I have directed can be said to describe this process where the balance between opposites is in a state of collapse and they must be brought back together into harmony. Paprika and the TV series Paranoia Agent are obvious examples.
Well, it reminds me of discussions we've had about holarchy and finding the balance between communion and agency.
Right? Yeah, he almost sounds like an integral philosopher here.
Right, he really does. And what you're talking about with the yin and the yang as being the yin yang, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
You're really talking about the idea of how one ascends the holarchy through the process of transcending and including.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd like to do actually a couple episodes on the yin yang. I've read a lot of the original Japanese and Chinese treatises on this symbol and these ideas and so on. And also in my youth, I had this vision that the yin yang was more of a three-dimensional object. And the vision was something like that. A single yin yang circle is a duality being subsumed into a unity, but that happened at infinite levels. So in a sense, I guess I was seeing the holarchy through the yin yang.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, when we talk about agency and communion, as you ascend the holarchy, the scope of it increases, and you really can't imagine what it's going to be like at the next level.
Yeah.
Your level, you can kind of project, think of something amazing, but it isn't equal to the task. Your imagination does not reveal it.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like that's part of what you're talking about, that this duality follows you as you go up. It just takes on different colors or flavors.
Yeah.
Plays out in different ways.
Right. I also think there's a kind of states and stages thing there where, well, I think you're actually kind of rubbing up against that too. But you can have a non-dual experience at any stage. And if you have this infinite kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, like an infinite line of yin yang symbols, and each one represents a stage, then you see that the non-dual is available at every level. But like you said, like the coloration or whatever is going to be different. The symbols are going to be different. The experience is going to be different because of what stage you're at. I think that's one of the things that the vision was getting at.
Right. You're also reminding me of the Merkaba.
What is that?
Well, when I lived in Brooklyn, I knew this Jewish woman who had a Star of David, but it was three-dimensional. And it was like two tetrahedrons brought together instead of two triangles.
Mm-hmm.
And the two triangles represented opposing but complementary principles in the same sense as yin and yang.
Right.
Thinking analogously, you think, okay, so the Star of David would actually be the shadow of this Merkaba figure on the wall of Plato's cave, if you will.
Right.
I'm thinking maybe you could kind of think that it's something similar going on with your intuition, intellection, apprehension of some three-dimensional yin-yang.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. For years, I've thought about, I wish that I could make a kind of model of what it was that I saw, but I guess you could say the plastic arts have been a weakness of mine. I'll keep with music and see if maybe a talented listener wants to take a stab at it. I think I mentioned Philip K. Dick before. Kon really was into him, and a Japanese author named Tsutsui, who wrote the original Paprika novel, who was a very similar writer to Philip K. Dick. And in that connection, there's a theme of mental illness in Paprika, right? The people in the dream world stay awake, but babble about crazy things. And a person in the presence of someone who is almost but not quite making sense in their speech will start to wonder if they themselves might be going crazy. And then when we're in the audience taking that in Paprika, it's like we could also start to feel that too. And I want to quote from The Two Truths and then add some thoughts into it as I read it and think through it. I wrote, "The technique of using point-of-view shots causes the audience to question what the reality of the situation is, and which can work to make the audience question what reality itself is, and perhaps how tenuous our grip on it is, was also used to perfection in Kon's Paprika. People walk and talk like they are one of us, while internally they are in the dream world, creating an uncanny effect. They start off making sense in their speech, but it transmutes into unconscious babble, making us feel like we might be going crazy, bringing the realization that insanity is quite close to us, just a thin membrane away. For example, after the researchers discover that the dream device, the DC Mini, has been stolen, and they are discussing what to do about finding the thief, Shima says, well, There was a certain bodhisattva who never said that a thief is necessarily bad, but starting to row ourselves towards recovering the DC Mini rather than Paprika's bikini is the discipline of happiness. The 5-court ladies, too, danced to the flutes and drums of the frogs. It was like computer graphics. And then he jumped out of a window.
I was going to ask you, is that before he ends up flying out that window? It's interesting because at first it actually kind of makes sense. So you're thinking, this guy's saying something really deep. I'm going to have to think about that. And then you're like, wait a minute. What the hell is going on?
Okay, so the book continues. One way in which the inner and outer merge is that the unconscious forces us to act, and those acts affect our shared world. When people in Paprika are forced into an unconscious dream state, they start marching in parade formation while doing the Nazi salute. Many of the dolls and robots and so on in the dreams have one arm up Nazi style. This is a symbol of how, when we are under the sway of the unconscious, as in a dream, we are obeying the unconscious in a totalitarian fashion. And that was actually something that was in the original novel, and Kon just kept it in the movie as well. Kon made a Freudian reference to the unconscious, stating that Detective Konakawa's dream of many clowns coming out of a tiny car is the huge resulting from the small. One of the main points, I think, is here in this reference to how little and subtle misperceptions or beliefs about ourselves and the world turn into mental habits that, through a kind of butterfly effect, can end up ruining our lives, you know? It's also a picture of the tiny psychic dilemma and the mass shooting that results. To us, our own unconscious is unknown. Hence, mechanisms like projection work to make it seem like what is within us is, rather, out there in the world. We react as if they were external, and that in turn affects our psychology and so on.
Yeah, I mean, this dynamic that you're talking about is the confusion, the struggle that humanity is going through, which really could be the difference between extinction or survival.
True.
I mean, there's so much confusion about projection, there's introjection.
Yeah. In a sense, you could say that Paprika is about that. At one level, you have Detective Konakawa. He's on the verge of mental illness, and it all comes back to just some tiny little thing that happened in the past. And then you have people like the old guy in the wheelchair. He went through something similar, there was something in his past that started him on a path of becoming twisted. And then the end of the film sees him as this kind of blackness devouring the world, right?
Right, well, being stuck in a wheelchair didn't help. But then again, that could also be metaphorical for some kind of mental handicap or hang-up.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I forget, I should have brought this up when we were doing the Yin Yang thing, but Zhang Zi's story of the butterfly, when we talked about, is it the ego that's real or is it the unconscious that's real and so on. And then the yin yang and the dualities becoming unities and so on. The butterfly story seems to really fit well there. And the butterfly story was used there was this audio drama companion to Perfect Blue that was put out, and they discussed the butterfly story in that. All right, let's see. Zhang Zi was a philosopher in ancient China who one night went to sleep and dreamed that he was a butterfly. He dreamt that he was flying around from flower to flower, and while he was dreaming he felt free, blown about by the breeze hither and thither. He was quite sure that he was a butterfly, but when he awoke he realized that he had just been dreaming, and that he was really Zhang Zi, dreaming he was a butterfly. But then he asked himself the following question: was I, Zhang Zi, dreaming I was a butterfly, or am I now really a butterfly dreaming that I am Zhang Zi?
This is also reminding me of Descartes.
Right. To bring it back to 13th floor.
Yeah.
So to me, in Paprika, mental illness is a symbol for something like the maximum amount of out of balance that we can get. And that lopsidedness shows up in most of the important characters in the movie. And of course, Kon himself talked about that lopsidedness, that it was an out of balanceness that needed to be restored to balance. you could say that Atsuko had kind of the smallest degree of it with hiding her feelings and all of that. And then you have the detective suffering from nightmares and panic attacks because of something he buried. I forget the details, but Himuro was blackmailing or paying Osanai to be his gay twink model or something. And Inui, the old guy in the wheelchair, who wanted to transfer himself into the younger body of Osanai, he becomes a giant blackness that's devouring the world. And, in the finale, you've got this black versus white yin yang thing. Old man versus female baby. And the female baby grows up into Atsuko as she swallows Inui, and, the balance is restored. And I read somewhere, Paprika's voice actress, Hayashibara Megumi, she shared her interpretation that the black slime that Inui turns into in the finale represents the unconscious. And its blackness is the opaque nature, which disallows Inui from knowing what he is doing. The blackness is the opaque nature of each of our unconsciouses, which keeps ourselves as mysteries to ourselves in a way. And, not knowing what we are doing, that threatens to destroy the earth, for the whole world to be eaten. So I think really the theme there is of people not knowing what they're doing. I think what Kon is saying is something very Platonic. Perplexity for Plato was the yin-yang flip side of revelation. And so if you put the opposites of perplexity and revelation into proper relation or harmony, as Kon would have said, then you've got something going on. But without that kind of balance, things go lopsided. And as I've seen in kind of America recently, you end up with perplexity being a badge of pride. And in that case, it's all just stupidity until the world dies.
Well, it's perplexity on the one hand. On the other hand, it's really rigid certitude.
Yeah.
And it's actually an unwillingness to admit perplexity about a certain set of topics.
Definitely.
Right. Anything that involves being politically polarized.
Mm-hmm.
There's not supposed to be any question about what is self-evidently true.
Right.
I mean, you're making me think about the Sufi philosopher Ibn Arabi, who said, awareness of confusion is not confusion.
I know in the literature on the two truths, there's some things written about this. Someone is just completely wrong about something. They're just mistaken, misguided. And because of that, they're seeing the world in the wrong way. But the truth is that they are in samsara. So even if they get their head right about the thing that they're wrong about, that's like one twist and the lid is still tightly in place.
Right, which goes back to the point that you were making before, which I think is really interesting, that when the person who is under the influence of the DC Mini with someone else hacking into their mind, and they start speaking and they sound crazy, you begin to question your own sanity. And that's part of your experience as a viewer of the film. And that's actually a good thing because the constructs wherein we dwell are so contingent.
Mm-hmm.
And they're structured according to a set of assumptions, and we're in a certain kind of reality tunnel. And while we may want to preserve the functionality, there's also something to appreciating just how provisional it all is and what the real possibilities for freedom might be.
Yeah, right. The next thing I want to discuss is the real fake divide. What do you say?
Oh, that sounds great.
Okay, so real fake is Atsuko real and Paprika fake. For Kon, it's really that they're opposites, but they're both real. And Kon also tries to get us to realize that the real fake duality is actually at a certain level, a unity or a singularity. And in the yin yang, the division between the two sides creates or is part of a greater oneness. And that's pretty much like this symbol that I'm seeing at work in Paprika. And this reality to the fakes and so on, this set of insights that you find in Paprika and also in Perfect Blue and Paranoia Agent, it's a really powerful set of insights. I want to describe the real fake identity in Perfect Blue really quickly. That's, I think, the best way to show it. And then to also show how it happens in Paprika. This is just riffing on the stuff that I wrote in The Two Truths. Mima in Perfect Blue is a fledgling actress whose agency talks her into doing a rape scene. It's a disturbing scene to watch. She's a very pure and naive girl, and it actually looks like she's being raped. And Kon really plays with that. He lets it get real and disturbing, and then the director of the rape scene will yell cut because something wasn't right about it. So we keep getting pulled into the rape and then knocked out of it to realize it's just a scene in a show in a movie we are watching. And then to quote and add some thoughts, Mima's rape scene is a main key to the whole film by way of it being a fake that is also real. Our immediately real emotional responses come from a fake scene, and it is a real fake we are experiencing, precisely parallel to Mima's experience, where she is forced to go naked and be groped by men for a fake scene, where the rape is fake, but the humiliation and stigma and harm to her reputation and all of that are all real. There's a cut scene in the movie where Mima goes to a convenience store, and a girl notices her and says to her friend, "Hey, that's the girl that got raped." The rape scene also reveals to us the paradoxical power of the fake to invoke in us authentic experience. The real can come out of the fake. And it shows how there is some kind of identity between the fake and the real, that they are not exactly opposite. And then in Paprika, to quote from my book again, this real-fake concept is spoken out loud by a character at the end of the film. Detective Konakawa, the middle-aged policeman being treated by Paprika for anxiety and shame and later panic attacks, feels something he can't put his finger on, but that keeps showing up in a recurring nightmare. His issues, we discover, are related to something he stored away in his unconscious, a feeling that he had lost out in life by giving up on filmmaking at age 17. One behavior he shows is that he tries to avoid seeing the number 17. Another is that he professes a dislike for movies. But his unconscious is incessant in showing both films and the number 17 to him. In his youth, he made films about a cop endlessly chasing a criminal with a friend who has recently died, which triggered the nightmares. At the end of Paprika, he voices his integrating realization that, rather than causing him to lose out on life, his very career choice of policeman turned those early 8mm films into the real deal. He hears his deceased friend telling him that becoming a cop was a reality that came out of a fake. Konakawa then vows to embrace both the real and the fake equally.
One thought that comes to mind when talking about the real and the fake, what you're talking about with Detective Konakawa is what he was denying was returning to him in an amplified form.
Right.
And that function was a restoring force. It was serving the function to restore balance in his psyche, to keep him from destroying himself or going mad.
Yeah.
And the impression I got is that he's almost like a doppelganger, maybe for Satoshi Kon himself. Some other version of him that did not become a filmmaker. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I like that, though.
You like that? I felt that in the background. I thought, well, this is a filmmaker making a movie about a guy who didn't become a filmmaker. And he's talking about this other person, and maybe that other image, that other person from Detective Konakawa's high school years, that's actually Satoshi Kon. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. You like that, because that thought just stayed with me.
Yeah, I like that.
A line from the Gospel of Thomas. If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you.
Yeah, that's really good.
It seems to relate to what you were talking about with the black slime, with the character Inui. Is that how you pronounce his name?
Inui, yeah.
Inui, yeah. And his opacity to himself. And also, in a sense, bringing forth Paprika. Paprika is the heroine of the film. And Atsuko actually succeeds in bringing Paprika forth. And in a sense, Paprika succeeds in bringing Atsuko forth. So there's definitely something interesting going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that connection from the Gospel of Thomas to Inui and his neglect to introspect. That makes him Like a doppelganger, like a negative doppelganger version of Konakawa, because Konakawa, realizes that there's a problem and he goes to seek therapy for it. And, he comes out integrated because of taking that path. Well, Inui's is just one of destruction while being unaware of himself.
Yeah. It's also interesting that that quote is from somewhere around 2,000 years ago. Reminds me, there was some ancient text that Jung was looking at, and he said a lot of his work was in that text.
Yeah, and it reminds me of when they found graffiti in ancient Rome. They translated it out, and it was like, your mom sucks big dicks or something.
Yeah.
How long has this tragedy been going on? So one of the scenes that I love in Paprika is when Konakawa's dream ends up being something that Paprika is watching alone in the movie theater. That's like so beautiful to me. And then later, Konakawa is next to her watching it together. And I don't know how many people pick up on this, but he was doing an Akira Kurosawa imitation when he was discussing the film techniques that were used in his dream.
Wow.
So there's an obvious convergence there between film and dream. And, films and dreams are both fakes in a sense, but there's an obvious realness. I think maybe the realness depends on the person. Some people will see it, will see films as real in the sense that they might have gotten something from a film that helped them to, improve their life in some way. And for other people, maybe a dream did the same for them. Also, there are root elements to stories that make them such that we want to hear them over and over again. And films and dreams are both stories in that sense, where if we let them affect us, they can change our lives for real. So again, you get this idea of the real coming from the fake.
Right. And didn't Kurosawa actually make a film called Dreams?
Yeah. It's one of my favorites of his. And, of course, he also did Rashomon. It's like a postmodern film from 1957. Let me see. Hold on a second. 1950. So, yeah, it's like a postmodern film from 1950, about the different realities taking place in different people's minds.
Oh, I've heard of this film, but I've never seen it. Is this where all these different people have different versions of what happened?
Yeah. A rape in the woods.
That reminds me of, I don't remember the author, but the story was, I think it was called How to Tell a True War Story.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrator says, if when you hear something described, all the versions sound different, that means that it actually happened.
Yeah. So on the topic of film, I brought up, of course, Kon's films as meta-commentary on films. And I want to quote from my book on that theme in Paprika and also in some other films, just running with this idea of the convergence of film and dream. In Dario Argento's The Stendhal Syndrome, which is actually referenced in one of the Perfect Blue works, Anna's confusion is also filmically reflexive. She is a film character trying on the identities of other film characters. In David Lynch's Lost Highway, Fred Madison escapes into a film noir. And in the Stendhal Syndrome, Anna, while trying out different identities, becomes a film noir character. Paprika makes a similar move. Many of the dream world illusions people enter are staple film genres or even specific films. Therapist Chiba Atsuko, using the DC Mini device, is able to enter other people's dreams and inhabit them as her alter ego Paprika to treat her patients by directly accessing their unconscious. In her treatment of Detective Konakawa, they quest through dream remakes of The Greatest Show on Earth, Tarzan the Ape Man, Roman Holiday, From Russia with Love, and the detective's own films made in his youth. Actually, Argento's The Stendhal Syndrome remakes and repurposes a scene from Roman Holiday. Konakawa's films were used as a movie in Paprika, though a lot of that was cut in the final picture. Later, Paprika uses her powers in the dream world to turn into equally genre-fitting or archetypal characters. A mermaid, Sun Wukong the Monkey King, Pinocchio, etc. All of this points to the connection between film and dream. But Kon takes all of this one step further in Paprika. While Konakawa's dreams, for example, are obvious cinematic references, with he and Paprika acting out Gregory Peck's and Audrey Hepburn's characters in Roman Holiday, for example, many of the scenes of waking reality are simply less overt cinematic references, complicating the relationship between waking and dreaming, illusion and reality. For example, the researcher Himuro K. His apartment is a take on J.F. Sebastian's place in Blade Runner. And the wheelchair-bound Inui, his office/greenhouse, is taken straight from Howard Hawks' film noir The Big Sleep. And then just a final idea on that. Besides the film and dream conversions, many of the dreamers in Paprika speak in 7 and 5 syllable meter, which was used in the novel Hell by Tsutsui Yasutaka, the author of the Paprika novel. So that actually gives us not just a connection from film to dream, but also a literary connection to dream.
Well, in this sense, I think Satoshi Kon is very similar to David Lynch.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I did make that connection in my book, but I'm not sure if anyone actually has, made that connection before. It's kind of strange. Let me just send you so you can see what I mean about Howard Hawks' The Big Sleep.
Okay.
Just send you a link here.
I definitely recognize also just the images from J.F. Sebastian's apartment in the army of bizarre figures in the dream sequences.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that parade, the mix of salarymen killing themselves and guys taking photos up the skirts of schoolgirls and
right.
The Buddhas and Matryoshka dolls and all of the cultural ephemera. There's so much to gain from the parade. I almost want to do a second episode on it. But for that, I'll again turn people to the book, The Two Truths, because I get into a lot of things on that, especially connecting it to the film Rojin Z. I think some people might get a lot out of that.
Okay, so I'm looking at these images from The Big Sleep. It's unmistakable if you've seen the movie and you look at these images, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's a clear nod to this film.
Right. So, you have the dream sequences and then you have them referencing films, but then you see that the waking sequences are also referencing films. So I think there's a lot to cull from that as well.
Right. And also just this general idea that our waking consciousness in many ways is not that different from our dreaming consciousness. It's dreaming consciousness plus this little layer. On the other hand, that little layer, the way that it functions, the way that we construct our reality tunnels, is sufficiently alienating from that dynamic process that's going on, that it actually creates, I think, something that's more of like for a lot of people, more like a nightmare.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to talk about is the holarchy. But before that, just a quick mention. I was thinking to save this for the return, but given that the return, our episodes on Twin Peaks The Return are probably going to run over 10 hours, it probably makes sense just to give a mention here. This is just a really quick thing. According to the storyboards for Paprika, Kon wanted it to seem to the audience like Atsuko had sex with Konakawa in the first scene where he wakes up after treatment and it appears like she is sleeping next to him. And throughout the film, there are other shots and scenes of her and her Paprika alter ego, which are to be subtly taken as erotic. And this is because Kon thought of Paprika as a sacred prostitute. I don't really want to go into that here, but I just wanted to mention that angle for interpretation is there. And for any Twin Peaks fans, we'll be discussing that in relation to Twin Peaks, and so probably Paprika will be brought up again there.
Yeah, I like that. And if you go with my hunch about Detective Konakawa, then you could see some relationship between Paprika's sacred prostitute and Satoshi Kon himself.
Yeah, I like that. So I'm not sure if anyone has hit on this before, but I mentioned in one of my books, and I think I might be the first one, to note that the structure of the holarchy is fractal. And I want to use a specific example from Paprika to show a fractal holarchic structure. One consequence of the structure of the holarchy being fractal is the pre-trans fallacy. And that's because different levels of the holarchy appear to be the same. So you can be climbing down the ladder, to paraphrase Nick Cave, and think you're climbing up because of its self-similar nature. Things at different levels appear to be but aren't the same. And that's one cause of people being mistaken. Anyway, in Paprika, at one point when Konakawa is driving his car, there is a bus ahead of him with an advertisement on its rear for a loan center. And the message on the advertisement is, make your dreams come alive, or make your dreams come true, or become real. And this is not only what Konakawa did by progressing from making movies about a cop to becoming a real detective, but it's also a message on the entire idea of the film, that through the DC Mini, dreams will invade the waking world. The dreams do come alive or become real. This makes Konakawa's arc in the film a microcosm of the film Paprika itself. And I think I mentioned earlier another level on which that is true. We unravel the mystery of his recent mental illness and the bigger mysteries of the theft of the DC Mini and what is happening to reality and so on. So in a lot of senses, the Konakawa arc and character is a microcosm of the film itself. And that makes me think that you're really onto something with the Konakawa and Kon connection. And then, I just noticed also the name Konakawa, Kon. Maybe there's something to that. When Inui's black slime form starts making the world disappear, if we take the voice actress's interpretation that I mentioned before, that the blackness is the unconscious, then the disappearance of the world is only a macrocosmic version of those things that Konakawa was hiding from himself. And I've also felt that most of Kon's works are fractal in a similar way. One technique he uses is where the same lines are said over and over in different contexts, and or by different people, or by different aspects of a person at different levels of reality. Paprika expands the depth of that technique in a lot of ways, but I think I would rather let people explore that themselves. I would just say to, look for the repeated lines in Paprika, and I think you'll quickly find some interesting things to interpret there.
Yeah, and also the way in which a repeated line will have different meaning in different contexts is really interesting.
Right. I laid out how that works for a number of the repeated lines in Perfect Blue in the book, but again, I kind of left it as an exercise for the reader for Paprika.
Right. Since contexts are constantly shifting and we can miss out on how they're shifting, that can often blind us to the subtleties of meaning.
Very true.
Since you brought up the holarchy, there's another thought that I had while watching this film, and it's related to how holons work when you're talking about a superholon that's composed of subholons, where there is a kind of master holon, if you will, at a certain level, right? So for a given superholon, and that holon essentially has control. So, I think you talked about it even here. The mind sends a signal and my arm moves if I want to move my arm.
Mm-hmm.
So that all the different subholons are more or less subservient to the superholon.
Yeah.
Whereas you don't really have that kind of superholon, that kind of master holon functioning in a social context. This is something Wlber has talked about. There's just a kind of style of discourse. And so if you want to interact with a group of people in a certain social context, you have to speak in a certain manner, comport yourself in a certain manner to have a successful interaction with that group.
Mm-hmm.
Were it otherwise, you would have total tyranny, right? And that's actually why it's often the case if a society is sliding towards tyranny, you'll hear more biological metaphors used to describe the state.
Mm.
And I feel that one issue that I picked up on in Paprika is this idea of being overwhelmed by the collective. And you were talking about that where they were doing the Nazi salute when they were marching in the parade.
Yeah.
And that to me feels like the point at which you lose your autonomy to the collective.
Mm-hmm.
scene that really interested me was when she went into what she believes to be Himuro's dream to help Tokita.
Yeah.
And then she comes back and she says it's not his dream anymore.
Right.
And Shima says, so he was a victim too? And then she says, he's an empty shell. He was invaded by a collective dream.
Mm-hmm.
And then Shima says a collective dream. And she says, with no access restriction, the DC Mini can be used to invade any psychotherapy machine. Every dream it came in contact with was eaten up into one huge delusion.
Mm-hmm.
So she's talking about the collective dream.
Yeah.
And it's a really powerful scene because they're driving through this tunnel and there's rain on the windshield and you see these droplets of water coalescing into this larger stream. And it's disturbing. It's a fear of being absorbed into this collective, into this unconscious system that essentially destroys your dream and assimilates you into it.
Yeah, yeah. Especially in the novel, though it's also mentioned in the movie, there's this discussion about anaphylaxis. I don't fully understand what was going on there, but, anaphylaxis has something to do with allergies and allergic reactions, like antibodies in the body reacting to allergens.
Right.
And it seemed like that was kind of the way that the collective dream spread, like through some kind of resonance between dreams or something like that, like almost like a computer virus, like it could spread in that way. I'm not really sure. But yeah, there's something really interesting to this idea of the collective dream and being devoured by it. To me, it doesn't really seem like it's the Jungian collective unconscious idea. It almost seems like, I'm having a dream and there are kind of shorthand things in there and like symbols that are just like a part of my psychic economy that I can relate to and understand. But then when you have Shima talking about the ladies dancing with the frogs and then jumping out the window, it's almost like if you were in someone else's dream, maybe the symbolism and shorthand wouldn't make any sense to you. And so it would just be like a world that just seems completely insane.
Yeah, there's definitely that aspect to it. I think there's also an aspect of maybe what I would relate to Jürgen Habermas, the idea that the system colonizes the life world, that the way that we experience things and that the way that we interpret things has been conditioned in a way by the system that we live in that's almost over-determines things to a certain degree and fixes meanings in a way that creates a prison for the mind as well. Part of that system is the idea that a person has to work 9 to 5, that you have symbols that are expressions of kind of ideological commitments that were made through us and we kind of absorbed, and now we're just operating in this rigid structure of a colonized imagination. And that if we don't have sufficient will, if we can't question it, it can just absorb us and we will essentially lose our souls.
Yeah, I think that there's really something there with, that the people are doing the Nazi salute, and also that, the kind of crazy talk they engage in is in that 575 meter, which was used in Tsutsui's novel Hell, a kind of stilted collective imagination place, a totalitarian government place. That's hell. We might be trapped up in our own mind games, like Konakawa avoiding movie theaters and the number 17 or something, such that Utsuko, she chides Tokita for being just wrapped up in his, like the technological games that he was playing and like making the DC Mini and stuff and not really caring about the possible consequences and the real consequences. She accuses him of masturbation. And that's a kind of hell, that's like a kind of singular hell. And I think that the Nazi salute parade is a kind of collective hell. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at.
Right. And to give a context, Jürgen Habermas, who formulated this idea of the system colonizing the life world, Nazi Germany was his youth. There's a line where you see Himuro. He's experiencing the dream passively. And then someone says something about his left brain is far away and rotting or something. That seems to me to be a feature of what we're talking about. So he doesn't have that discernment anymore. And going back to the scene that I was describing that's so beautiful with Atsuko in the car, that whole scene turns out to be a dream sequence. And then the next thing you know, she's there with Inui, and it's the big sleep imagery that you're talking about in the greenhouse.
Yeah.
So I think part of that dynamic is the fear of being absorbed and digested by this collective delusion, and then also the kind of issue Baudrillard points to where the demarcation between simulation and that which is not being simulated is extremely difficult to identify, which was part of his criticism of the Matrix movies, at least the first Matrix movie.
Yeah, I remember that's a great point. What did he say, that the first Matrix movie is the kind of movie that the Matrix would make?
Right, exactly.
Have you ever been choked out in jiu-jitsu practice?
Not actually choked out, no.
Okay. That's a really interesting experience because, you can even have full long dreams during the time that it happens. And then you wake up and some guy is hugging you or whatever. And you're just like, what happened? And then they're like, oh, you got choked out and now you're awake. And it's crazy how quickly, you're looking for answers. You have no idea what's going on. And then someone tells you and then you go, oh, okay. And this waking reality, again, has the quality to it that makes it seem like a real reality to you. It happens very quickly. And I feel like with all of the shifts that happen in Paprika and other films from Kon, he tricks us into these situations all the time of believing a dream and then finding out that it was just a dream, or believing a scene and then finding out it was just a movie being made somewhere and so on. And then there are levels to it so that you can wake up into another dream and so on. That's something that we really need to learn about, so that when consensual reality is crazy, we don't just settle into it as the real reality. When the collective is crazy, we don't just take our place, our passive place within that system. And also, I think that those kind of fake outs and stuff that Kon is a master at, beyond any interpretations that can be made of the film actually just has to be experienced in order to put yourself in these situations where reality becomes kind of more fluid and your grip on it more tenuous.
Right, 100%. Everyone should watch Paprika. Yeah, it's one of the most amazing experiences you can have with a film. And going back to Baudrillard and what he said about The Matrix, he referred to Mulholland Drive as a masterpiece. I mean, we were talking about the scene with the singer, and even though he tells you this is lip sync, this isn't real, you nevertheless believe that it's real. And it's so emotionally powerful, and that connects to what you were talking about, the real from the fake. Well, I don't know what Baudrillard ever said about Satoshi Kon, but he would have to say, by the same criteria, that Paprika's a masterpiece.
Absolutely. I would have to say that Mulholland Drive is actually the most Kon-like of Lynch's films.
It sounds like this could be a whole other podcast.
Yeah. Well, make your dreams come true, become real, watch Paprika. So do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.